But you must not change one thing, one pebble, one grain of sand, until you know what good and evil will follow on the act. The world is in balance, in equilibrium. A wizard's power of changing and of summoning can shake the balance of the world. It is dangerous, that power. It is most perilous. It must follow knowledge and serve need. To light a candle is to cast a shadow. Part 1. Summary. A Wizard of Earthsea is a fantasy coming-of-age story that follows Jed, a young mage born in a village on the island of Gaunt. Jed's abilities are discovered by his witch aunt, who takes him under her tutelage, until Jed uses his magic to save his village from destruction by the Kargs. Stories of Jed's abilities reach the powerful mage Ogion, who takes Jed away from his hometown to be his apprentice. Jed's impatience and desire for power makes him impatient with his master, and soon he leaves to study magic at the renowned school for wizards on the island of Rogue. Jed's power and arrogance continue to grow until, in a contest with a rival student, he releases a dangerous shadow that wishes to possess him. Jed then journeys across the archipelago, both pursued and in pursuit of the shadow. Part 2. An unorthodox classic fantasy. A Wizard of Earthsea is a great classic fantasy novel, because although it's embedded very much in the traditional classic fantasy style that we get from Tolkien, it subverts many of the classic fantasy staples in many interesting ways. The first thing that I noticed when I picked up the book is how short it is. It comes in at just around 200 pages, and the sequels, at least the 4 sequels that I have, because they're all in one book together, they're all roughly the same length. They're all very short books. This already sets it against classic fantasy, and even more modern fantasy, which tends to be, huge tomes of thousands of pages with many sequels, each of them also thousands and thousands of pages. This doesn't mean, though, that it is lightweight or, flim-flam and vague in terms of characters and world building. The world building here is just as complex and interesting, if not more complex and interesting, than much bigger novels. Le Guin does a fantastic job of bringing complex themes, complex worlds, complex characters, all within very small scope, just 200 pages of word count, making this, even though it's a very short novel in terms of page count and page number, a very dense novel in terms of the content. It took me a couple of reads actually, initially getting off, to actually get into the story, because there's just so much detail going on that if you don't pay attention you actually might miss a lot. As an example of how much Le Guin can do in a very short span of time, consider the middle to latter part of the novel, where Jed is basically going on a quest, pursuing the shadow and also being pursued by it at one point, and he finds himself on many of these different islands, and in the span of like a couple of pages you could have been to 3 different islands, and in that short span of time Le Guin is able to give you a sense of the place that you're in, a sense of the type of people that live there, their culture, and if you were to read this, like I said before, very quickly, you wouldn't actually pick up on this and you might think that there's not much there. But when I reread this a bit slower the second time round, I actually found that there is a lot of detail there. You just have to make sure that you're reading the book very slowly to appreciate it all. What's great about all this is that if you are paying attention, when you get to the end of the 200 pages, even though you haven't read a 1,000-page novel, it feels like you have. It feels like you've read an epic, even though it came in at just 200 pages, which is a pretty impressive feat to give someone that sense of being overwhelmed and immersed in this world when they've only been, reading the book for a few hours. It's a lot easier to give that sense of being overwhelmed when your book is 1,000 pages long, because it's just so big and dense to get through. Whereas to do that with just 200 pages or so is really, really impressive. The world of Earthsea is also fascinating. Rather than being a big continent, it is just a group of islands, all with very, very different cultures and styles, mostly populated by the Hardic people, who are dark-skinned, although there are also the white-skinned Kargs, who are kind of barbarians that feature at the beginning of the novel, and there are dragons in the far western islands as well. It's a shame that adaptations of this series have actually whitewashed the main characters, because it was very much Le Guin's intention to have non-white characters at the front and centre of this fantasy, which again sets it apart from classic fantasy, which tends to be very European, very white. So it's nice to see, again, that difference, especially given how old this is. It's from the 60s. The final unorthodox thing I want to talk about with this book is the central plot itself. Again, most classic fantasy novels or series tend to focus on big, broad themes. They tend to be about big conflicts like wars, or the battle between good and evil, light and dark, and all of these things. And while there are elements of that within the story, the central plot is a psychological conflict going on within Jed himself. A Wizard of Earthsea is, at its core, a coming-of-age story about a young boy with lots of powers coming to take responsibility for those powers, and coming to recognise his darker self. While that's definitely front and centre though, again what I like is that Le Guin is able to tell this intimate personal story, but she does it in a large fantasy world that she's clearly thought about in depth, so that when you read the novel and when you're invested in Jed's storyline, it feels like you are reading something of that classic style. It feels like this is a big battle against light and dark and all of those big dramatic classic fantasy tropes, but actually it's a very personal, intimate story. It's just that she embeds it in this broader world and she tells it in such a way you feel like you're on one of those epic journeys, but instead you're actually following a very intimate journey, which again is just a fantastic way to tell a story, and again, bearing in mind the time, completely original and different. You can definitely see the influence that this has had on more modern fantasy, which, while it still might have some of those broader epic themes in terms of big battles, they do tend to be more character focused. Things like Game of Thrones, for example, or the Gentleman Bastard series, or even The Wheel of Time. These stories do have that much detailed and nuanced character focus, and I think you can see that stemming from novels like this. Part 3. An integrated magic system. When it comes to fantasy and magic systems, I tend to be indifferent in terms of soft or hard magic systems. What I really like though is when the magic system is somewhat reflected in the central conflicts going on with the characters, and again Le Guin is really good at doing this. As I said in the previous section, Jed's central conflict is being someone who has a lot of power and wanting to use that power, and he's very ambitious and wants to change the world, but he doesn't recognise the darkness and potential for evil within that desire to change things in a sort of reckless way. The quote that I began the video with describes pretty much the central principle of the magic system, which is this idea of equilibrium and balance. Although the wizards in Earthsea have a lot of power, they're very reluctant to use that power because they recognise that any change that they make with the use of magic can have dangerous or dark consequences, even if they don't intend those consequences themselves. This is a lesson that Jed has to learn, not just in terms of understanding the magic system and his powers, but also a lesson that he needs to learn for himself as someone who wants to change the world without really thinking things through. Jed needs to learn that his pride and hubris and power may lead him to the dark side, if you like, which is something that's also reflected in the magic system itself. And that's just a really good use of a magic system, because what happens there is you don't get convoluted ad hoc things to the magic system where something just pops up that's very convenient for the plot and fixes things. Instead, you have a magic system that's embedded in the central conflict, and they mesh really well together. Some people argue in terms of critical analysis of the book that the message of the story is essentially a conservative one. The idea that to change things is bad and you must preserve the status quo and the equilibrium. While I think that's definitely a part of the message, though I do think it's wrong. Le Guin isn't telling people that change is bad in this novel. She's telling them that to make changes heedlessly without thinking things through is a bad thing. The fact that Jed wants to use his powers isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's that he doesn't think things through. The central conflict that he gets involved with is a contest where he then releases the shadow. He's trying to make a change in the world because of pride and arrogance, and that has bad consequences. And the lesson that he needs to learn isn't that change is bad, it's that changing things recklessly or for stupid reasons such as pride is bad. So I don't think the novel is particularly conservative. I just think it's urging caution to people who want to make change. It wants you to think about what you're doing rather than just going ahead blindly and changing things for the sake of it. Again, it's the idea that by lighting a candle, which is something you presume to bring light, also may cast a shadow. There may be these darker things and you need to think about that, you need to be wary of it, and you also need to take responsibility for it, which is what Jet ultimately does in the story. Part 4. A story for all ages. A Wizard of Earthsea was actually marketed originally as a children's book, and for a long time it was seen as children's fiction, and therefore somewhat overlooked for that reason. This isn't so much true anymore. There's definitely a growing appreciation for these books, but you can certainly see why that's the case, why there is such an appreciation for these books. They have such a complex metaphysical system in the magic, in the world building, they have such a complex philosophical set of ideas going on, ethics, characters, all of these things. And while the way the story is told, it is told in a way that you could read this to a child, like a young child or something like that, and they would appreciate it, they'd think it was great. You can also, as a young adult or as an adult, read the book and take a lot more from it, because it does have these broader, complex themes that it's using fantasy to illustrate. As the end of the last section I was getting at this, there is a lot to dissect here, and we could have a whole video, or several videos, analysing all the various philosophical points that Le Guin is making in this story that she tells. Essentially, Le Guin seems to me to be doing what a lot of classic writers did in the past, which is to use fantasy settings, fantasy tropes, as a vehicle to tell a much bigger story about the nature of morality or society or all these kinds of things. This was something that was very common in classic works of fiction. You have things like Faust, you have things like Dracula, the Odyssey or the Iliad. All of these great works of fiction using fantasy as a way to illustrate much bigger points. And I would definitely see A Wizard of Earthsea, and possibly the series further on. I haven't actually read the later ones, but I would imagine it's similar, as doing that kind of work. So it is a bit of a shame that these novels have been looked down on a little bit in the past. But luckily that does seem to be changing, and also in terms of fantasy more generally now, there does seem to be a growing appreciation for fantasy as a legitimate genre of fiction. But I also think that's great. If you can have a novel that has such a broad appeal that you can read it as a fun adventure story to children, where they can relate to the central story of the character growing up, but then at the same time that there is other themes that are more universal, so that adults can appreciate it as well, that's just a fantastic story. The best stories in the world are the ones that have universal themes that we can all pick up on, no matter how old we are or where we're from. And reading this, it was really one of those experiences for me. I thought it was great, I really liked the messages, and I'm looking forward to digging deeper into this series in the future. Part 5, Conclusion. A Wizard of Earthsea is just a great classic fantasy novel, and I can definitely see how it's paved the way for more modern fantasy series, as I said, like Game of Thrones, or Gentlemen Bastards, or Wheel of Time, all of these character-based, focused fantasy novels, and there are certainly links between that and Harry Potter for sure. It's got a complex world, an interesting world, some great characters with nuanced psychologies, and it does all of this in such a short span of time that it's hard not to be just wowed by that fact. If I was to give one weakness of the novel, or one thing that I didn't like, it was that it is a bit of a difficult read, although I don't know how much of a bad thing this is, but I would say that because it is so short, you can miss a lot of things when you're reading it. So at least it may, when you first read it, put you off. You may not appreciate the subtleties going on, you may think this is just too quick, I don't like it, but if you persevere with it, if you give it another read, I think that problem kind of goes away. I think you'll kind of dig deeper into it. Another problem, maybe there's a bit of a thing, is the sexism of the book, but this is something that Le Guin kind of backtracks on later on, and I think that the idea was to set up some idea that the world was somewhat sexist, and then in later novels address those problems. So while it's weird to read the first book and that be a problem, I think it is something that goes away in the later books, so if that's something that bugs you when you read it, bear in mind that this is something she rectifies later on. But yeah, overall, probably one of my favourite fantasy books that I've read so far this year. I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to picking this up and carrying on in future videos for sure. Okay, that's it for today's video. I hope everyone is doing okay in self-isolation or social distancing. It's got a bit crazy, but if there was ever a time to pick up a new fantasy series, it would be now while you're inside. So give this a go, I hope you enjoy it, and let me know in the comments if you've read it, or if you do read it at some point in the future, what you think of the series. Also let me know what you think I should review in the future. I've got a lot of spare time to do some reading, so please recommend away. Until next time, take care everyone, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bish bash bosh, bing bang bing.